So, in my recent review of Artemis Fowl, I had a lot to say about the villain and how she was one of the worst written villains I've ever come across. But that got me thinking, just who else is on that list? A great hero always needs a great villain to truly complete the story. Put a weak villain up against even the strongest of heroes and it can end up dragging the story down and making the hero look weak. So today, I figure, it's time to go through the top 10 worst villains I've ever come across. A couple of rules. Number 1, I'm only listing villains of movies and television, so no video games, theatre, books, or even wrestling heels. Second, only one villain per franchise. And third, context matters. There are many bad villains from already bad movies, but to make the list, they have to really stand out and be a considerable detriment. Finally, this is very much my own personal list and opinion, so as always, feel free to disagree. With that, let's begin. Number 10. Opal Koboi from Artemis Fowl. Alright, let's start off with the villain who inspired me to make the list. Opal is a mysterious, powerful fairy who hides in the shadows, never revealing her face, kidnaps our protagonist's father, and demands a super weapon so she can destroy all humans, since humans used to hate fairies. To summarise why she's a bad villain, that basic sentence I just said is literally all we ever find out about her. What's her backstory? How does she know Artemis Senior? What does her face look like, and why do we never see it? Why does she kidnap a fully grown adult and demand his preteen son bring her the ransom when it would make more sense to do it the other way around? The answer to all of these questions and more can be summarised as pfft. Literally, all Opal has going for her is that she's mysterious, which doesn't work because the story wants to reveal nothing but forgets that revealing reasons to fear her was probably important. And also, her mysterious silhouette makes her look like she's wearing a hoodie. Not exactly dark fairy overlord material there. Number 9. David the android from Alien Covenant. Content note, this entry contains discussions of sexual assault. Please skip to this point if you're not comfortable with that. Probably one of the more controversial candidates on this list, but hear me out. David was first introduced in Prometheus, and while he is at first a pretty likeable character, his sudden evil streak kind of appears out of nowhere and isn't entirely explained. The sequel, Alien Covenant, does not help with this. He's just awful in this. Don't get me wrong, I know villains are meant to be awful, but his creepy behaviour is so over the top and on the nose that it just feels awkward. So all of a sudden he's obsessed with creation? Okay, but why does he want to create disgusting monsters? Why does he have this sick love for them? Why did he mass murder the engineers just to accomplish this? And why is he sexually assaulting people? The latter part in particular grinds my gears as being a cheap way to creep out the audience and make us hate him. I know the Alien franchise has always deep down been about sexual assault, but it was always told through subtle, clever metaphors with the xenomorphs, who, quite frankly, are far better antagonists than this guy. Do we really need an obviously creepy villain forcibly kissing the hero and threatening to mutate her into his personal pet? Overall, it's the complete on-the-nose lack of subtlety that's the problem here. David is so obviously over-the-top evil, and you expect me to believe these people didn't notice. I cannot take his scenes seriously, and for that reason, he makes the list. Number 8. Khan from Star Trek Into Darkness. As I said earlier, when it comes to this list, context matters. If I were to make a top 10 best villains list, then the original Khan Noonien Singh would be a serious contender. A genetically engineered superhuman tyrant with an intense obsession with getting vengeance on Captain Kirk. The version we got in the reboot really does pale in comparison, quite literally to some degree. While Benedict Cumberbatch is a good actor, he absolutely does not bring the same energy and charisma to the role as Ricardo Montalban. The Khan we see in this movie is not at the same point as the version we saw in Wrath of Khan. The latter was a man whose life had been ruined by our heroes to the point where he's completely fixated on destroying them. This version has only just met our heroes. They don't have the same connection, and Khan barely has enough time to really get across any sort of true character, especially when half the time he's just playing second fiddle to Admiral Marcus. While this Khan is mostly just bland, forgettable, and woefully mismanaged and underused, it still feels like a pointless bastardization of the original character. Don't bother adapting a character if you're just going to be this lazy and uninspired with them. That said, I don't feel this Khan quite ruins the brilliant original version, unlike certain other characters we'll be seeing on this list. Number 7. Dawn Bellwether from Zootopia. So, there's been a trend as of recent in Disney films that's become known as the surprise villain, as in a villain who is initially presented as a hero, but is actually the villain in secret. While these can sometimes work, often it can fall rather flat. Not only are we at a point where it's expected, thus has lost all shock value, but spending so much time with the heroic version of the character means that the villainous side is never really developed. While there are many options to choose from here, I decided to go with Dawn Bellwether from Zootopia as a kind of representative figure for all the bad surprise villains. Now, don't get me wrong, Zootopia is a good movie, but I take issue with the fact that Bellwether's heel turn comes right out of nowhere, feels like an immediate good to over-the-top evil switch, and lasts for about 5 minutes. Yes, I suppose the idea that the adorable sheep was evil all along is clever, but at this point, surprise villains were getting old. Despite all of her scheme being enjoyable to watch, she as a character is barely shown playing a role in it, thus we never really get to appreciate her as the villain. Bellwether exists purely for a plot twist. Yes, maybe her motivations are believable, and yes, we do see her being mistreated, but what the hell drove her to be willing to have Judy murdered before her eyes? When you spend so little time with a character as a villain, then their villainy will be far less developed and have a lot less impact. Number 6. Aldrich Killian, aka the real Mandarin, from Iron Man 3. While surprise villains are an unfortunate norm amongst modern Disney animation, boring, bland villains are an unfortunate norm of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Not all of their villains are bad, but there's been a lot. Much like how Bellwether is kind of a representative of the surprise villains, I picked Aldrich Killian as the representative for bad Marvel villains. Why him when there are so many other terrible options? Well, once again, context. Specifically, Iron Man 3 introduces a different villain, a mysterious terrorist known as the Mandarin, played by Sir Ben Kingsley, who, at first, does come across as effective and intimidating, but he's just dropped halfway through the movie. Okay, interesting twist, but one that needs a good follow-up. If you're going to reveal that the villain you've been building up was just a false lead, you'd better have something really good to follow it up. And oh boy, this guy wasn't it. Aldrich Killian is your typical villain who starts off as kind of awkward and nerdy, then gains power and turns evil. While the super soldier fire powers he develops are kind of cool, it doesn't really make up for what an uninteresting guy he turns out to be, especially given that the false Mandarin he sets up comes across as far more interesting. Even if you argue characters like Ronan or Yellow Jacket or Dark Elf guy are more boring, at least they didn't have a potentially much cooler villain cast aside in favour of them. Number 5. Doctor Doom from Fantastic Four. Now, before you say anything, yes, technically Doom is also a Marvel villain, but I am counting the Disney MCU and the Fox Marvel movies as two separate franchises here. Those who can accept that are probably still wondering why I chose this guy rather than this abomination that crops up on every worst villains list. Well, as awful as that incarnation of Deadpool was, at the very least, Ryan Reynolds was trying when playing him as Wade Wilson, and plus, that story did eventually have a happy ending. Van Forstek's Doctor Doom, on the other hand, is generally awful throughout. Now, I've never read a Fantastic Four comic, but I at least know that Victor Von Doom is supposed to be the tyrannical leader of a fictional European country, not an irritating, arrogant computer hacker. And then comes his transformation, and good God, who thought this was a good idea? He looks like a crash test dummy made of tinfoil and glow sticks. His transformation is caused by being abandoned on Planet Zero, yet rather than seeking petty vengeance, he's decided he loves Planet Zero and views it and himself as superior to the Earth and humans. Honestly, his motivations were kind of unclear, and unlike some of the other bad villains with hazy motivations, he looks like that. And honestly, that's flat out worse than not showing him at all. Number 4, Balaam from Jupiter Ascending. Anyone who's seen my Jupiter Ascending review probably won't be too surprised at seeing this dweeb here. Given how many villains on this list have been representatives for general bad villain types, let's say this guy is the representative for the so bad it's good movie villains. But, as entertaining as he is, Balaam is still really bad. He's an over-the-top ham who fluctuates between muttering his lines and screaming them. But despite this ludicrous presentation, not only are we supposed to take this guy seriously, but we're supposed to be surprised that he was the big bad behind the Queen's death. Balin's attempts at coming across as evil and intimidating just reek of desperation. He's like a 14-year-old on Tumblr trying to be as edgy as possible. Jupiter Ascending is a terrible movie in general, but Balaam very much stands out as one of its worst parts. He is probably the most entertaining villain on this list, but certainly not for the right reasons. Number 3, Steppenwolf from Justice League. Like Balaam, I've spoken about Steppenwolf before. In fact, I did an entire video on how to write a supervillain and specifically used him as an example of what not to do, because he is an absolutely atrocious excuse for a villain, and given some of the trash DC has put out, it says a lot that he's the worst. While some would argue that the Enchantress is just as bad, I'll argue that she was at least intimidating in her original form. Steppenwolf is not intimidating. He is not interesting in the slightest, his motivations are dull, his powers aren't particularly impressive, and even his design is too similar to Ares. The villain of your first ensemble movie needs to be threatening and intriguing if you want your new team of heroes to look strong. Yes, clearly Darkseid was going to be the final boss of the series, but that doesn't mean you can just completely flub your attempt at the first boss. As I've said, Steppenwolf doesn't even feel like a boss in his own right, but more like the mini-boss you fight at the end of the tutorial level. What more is there to say here? He's not interesting, he's not threatening, and he completely drags down the first attempt at making a genuine live-action Justice League film. Number 2, Daenerys Targaryen from Game of Thrones. Well, here's a surprise entry, but I don't think many folks will disagree with my reasoning here. No, Daenerys does not start off as a villain, but by the end of the series, there's no denying that she was being presented as one. Despite being built up as a flawed but otherwise heroic character for 7.5 seasons straight, it only took 2 episodes to turn Daenerys from a somewhat morally questionable leader who always wanted to defend the oppressed by any means necessary, to an evil tyrant willing to burn anyone and everyone alive for reasons. Now, I did enjoy Daenerys as a character up until this point. I did like that she was often at odds with enforcing her justice while trying to avoid becoming just like her tyrannical father, And while some of her actions were sinister, her reasoning was usually logical and in character. Then came the Bells, without a doubt the worst episode in the show's history. Daenerys absolutely could have worked as a villain, but her heel turn is so poorly executed. She has no reason to do what she does. It comes right out of nowhere and goes against everything we've seen thus far. Like I said in my How to Subvert Expectations video, it is only there for cheap shock value, and it was not worth this level of character derailment. Without a doubt, Daenerys had the second worst start of darkness I've ever seen on screen. What was the worst, you ask? Well, number 1. Anakin Skywalker from the Star Wars prequels. This character is number 1 for a specific reason. While he is a bad villain in his own right, the character he will eventually become is honest to God one of the best. While the original Khan can be separated from the bad parallel we got in Into Darkness, there's no separating Anakin and Darth Vader. While I am, much like Obi-Wan in the originals, treating them like two different people here for the sake of the list, the fact that they are technically the same character still stands. It's one thing to be a bad villain, but it's another to almost completely ruin a fantastic villain in the process. Despite having such potential, Anakin Skywalker consistently comes across as whiny, his dialogue is rubbish, and his genuine moments of darkness are so often glossed over and mishandled. Remember that great moment when his mother dies and he loses it and massacres the Sand People? Wouldn't that make such a great fall to darkness moment? Nah, let's just completely forget that scene, have Palpatine say "do it" a couple of times, and then turn him. That works better. While Hayden Christensen's performance has often been criticised, honestly I don't think he's entirely to blame here. As I say, so much of Anakin's dialogue is pathetic, and so I can't really blame him. Like I've said, context really matters here. Darth Vader is one of the best, most memorable villains in cinema history. The start of Darth Vader's fall to darkness could have been fantastic. Unlike with Khan, whose perfect story had at least already been told, we hadn't seen this part of Darth Vader's story, and we were all raring to see it. And this is what we got. A whiny, entitled brat being easily manipulated by a blatantly evil Sith Lord, randomly accepting that it's now his role to literally kill children, all because he had a dream where his wife died. The complete waste of a potentially fantastic story, the whining, the fact that yes, he is worse than Kylo Ren because while Kylo Ren isn't great, he's at least better developed than Anakin, and the fact that he will forever remind us that one of the greatest villains of all time was once him. All of these, to me, make him the worst villain I've ever had to watch. Thanks for watching the video. What are your thoughts on who the worst villain of all time is? Do you disagree? Do you think there are other worse villains that I haven't named? Whatever your thoughts, be sure to mention them down below, like, share and subscribe and all that jazz, and I hope to speak to you again soon. Goodbye.